mainly in this country, people try to say that only blacks was enslaved in this country and that the Europeans or the whites were in some feudal system, which was totally inaccurate. England had laws where if you didn't support yourself, you was living on the street, you was automatically put into slavery. England shipped a lot of white slaves over here under the pretense that they couldn't support themselves, so they automatically enslaved them. So they were sold into slavery, and they were eventually shipped either here to the Caribbeans. And also a lot of slaves came from Ireland after Ireland became enslaved by the English king who enslaved them. He shipped majority of them over, well, they sold them into slavery, and eventually they either went down to the Caribbeans or either came to America.
Jewish Israel Cohen, A Racial Program for the 20th Century, 1912.
We must realize that our party's most powerful weapon is racial tensions. By propounding into the consciousness of the dark races that for centuries they have been oppressed by whites, we can mold them to the program of the Communist Party. In America we will aim for subtle victory. While inflaming the Negro minority against the whites, we will endeavor to instill in the whites a guilt complex for their exploitation of the Negroes. We will aid the Negroes to rise in prominence in every walk of life, in the professions and in the world of sports and entertainment. With this prestige, the Negro will be able to intermarry with the whites and begin a process which will deliver America to our cause.
So a lot of white slaves was shipped here. They was a lot cheaper than the African slave because I guess it was so plentiful of the white slaves. So basically, white slaves outnumbered black slaves here in this country. But that's not really recognized. I don't know why.
It's an interesting story, and it's an evolving one, this, because in the 16th century, most piracy takes place in galleys, in big rowboats, with maybe a rowing crew of 144. There'd be a fighting crew of another 100 or so. These ships are very fast, they're very effective, but they can't really move out of the Mediterranean. They rely on shock and awe to overcome their prey, so they will sail straight up to their victim. They will often ram their victim, and then they will just charge aboard. There's no, the kind of Errol Flynn notion of galleons sailing by firing broadsides at each other. Don't work when you've got 144 oars, 72 oars on each side of the ship. You can't do broadsides. These ships are really effective, but they've got a very limited range, because if you're carrying 200, 300, 400 people, you can only go for about 10 days before you've got to hit land and take on supplies and water. Now that's the norm in the 16th century. In fact, exactly in 1604, the new English king, James I, makes peace with Spain. And because of that, large numbers of English privateers, that is quasi-legal pirates who've been preying on the Spanish, are suddenly told you've got to stop robbing Spanish ships because the Spanish aren't the enemy anymore. And thousands of Englishmen move into the Mediterranean. They want to carry on being privateers come pirates, and they go for sanctuary. They turn Turk in the phrase. They go for sanctuary to Morocco, to Algiers, to Tunis, and indeed to Tripoli. The significance of all this, for your question, is that they bring with them Northern European navigational techniques. So within 20 years, the pirates of Barbary moved from galleys to the big round ships, the big sailing ships.
It's amazing how many people come to my channel who obviously don't know anything, implying and inferring that somehow white people were either indigenous to North Africa or that they just showed up one day voluntarily. They totally ignore the well-documented historical accounts of the fact that a large number of Caucasians were taken back to North Africa against their will as slaves, and many of them were enslaved and under the whip and rule of black people. Absolutely. They also want to deny they want to assume that if there were blacks involved in the Moorish expansion and the Moorish empires, that they were slaves, and they totally ignore the fact that the primary involvement that any white people had, for the most part, especially in the beginning, with the Muslim expansion, was as slaves. In fact, it says here that Mullah Ismail used, let's see, where was that at? Mullah Ismail is also known as a fearsome ruler. This is on Wikipedia under Ismail ibn Sharif. Is also known as a fearsome ruler and used at least 25 slaves for the construction of his capital. So I want you to imagine 25 slaves. 25 slaves, but I obviously meant 25,000 slaves. Building the capital, and the majority, and this, like I said, there's a white man telling you this, and it's well documented. There are many books that talk about this. Many accounts written by the white slaves themselves, who talks about the black slave drivers and how they basically enforce the Muslim rule over their white slaves.
We must realize that our party's most powerful weapon is racial tension. By propounding into the consciousness of the dark races that for centuries they have been oppressed by whites.
There are a lot of people that have a big problem with the truth of history, particularly when it comes to Africans, particularly when it comes to Egypt, the Moorish dynasties, and other aspects of history. One has to wonder why they are so desperate to subvert the truth and alter history. These images may give you a clue as to their reasoning. What you're looking at here is a famous painting by one of the most famous Orientalist painters. The Eurocentrists want to convince you that this gentleman and those that look like him were a typical representation of the famous Moors, who basically ruled and civilized much of Europe for over 700 years. In fact, the title of this famous painting is The Beggar. The Beggar. This man is a beggar. And that may lead to give us a clue as to why they want to change history, because they're not too proud of it. This is another famous painting. It is called The Captives. Now see, the Eurocentrists want to make all of the North Africans white, when this is a representation of white North Africans. This man who is the beggar, and these ladies who are the captives. They are a member of the harem of the Moors. What did the Moors look like? The Eurocentrists want to make the Moors white. This is a famous painting called The Guard of the Harem. That is a Moor. This clearly African Negro who is the guard of the harem. That is the member of the harem. This is what they don't want you to know about their history of enslavement.
Republican Party was founded by freed black slaves and anti-slavery white Americans. The Republican Party is the only party in America that was founded by black people. Not the Libertarian Party, not the Progressive Party, not the Democrat Party, not the Green Party. The only party ever founded by black people, by black Americans, is the Republican Party. The Republican Party today still stands for the same principles that it stood for in 1854 when it was founded. Check this out. Let me explain something to you. I'm about to drop some straight knowledge on y'all. The Republican Party, every principle that the Republican Party stands for is a principle that you can use if you were coming out of slavery. Understand that most of my constituents that I'm fighting for are in slavery. So the principles that I stand for got to be things that can help them when they come out of slavery. For example, the Second Amendment, standing for the right to bear arms. The reason why the Republican Party of today, the Republican Party of 1854, if I'm a slave, don't I need a weapon more than anybody else in the whole country, right? The Democrat Party, even then, was a party of slavery. The Democrat Party was against slaves having guns. And they weren't just against slaves having guns, they was against anyone having a weapon who wasn't a part of the government. Just the same policy they stand for today, they stood for in 1854 during slavery.
Also in the mid-1600s, the Irish always had problems with the British. Why? Anybody? Religion, exactly. Protestants and Catholics. And in the mid-1600s, there was another uprising, another rebellion in Ireland. And this gentleman, Oliver Cromwell, who became the first Lord and Protector of the British Commonwealth, went in there to quell one of those rebellions. And according to him, he did a fantastic job. He killed anywhere from 300,000 to 600,000 Irish. Home ownership for the Catholics went from 60% down to 8%. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the mid-1600s. It's a war. What do you get when you win a war? Spoils. What kind of spoils? Land, people. You get land and people and territory. And they got people. And they say they exported anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000 Irish slaves into the West Indies, Montserrat and Barbados, and into the colony of Virginia. So now you've got African slaves and African servants, European servants and Irish slaves, all mixing together in the same general area. They're working together, they're playing together. If the Africans have converted, they're going to church together. What else do you think they do together?
Sleep together.
Of course. You see, they're the same class. The color line has not been invented yet. They are the same class of people. So they're all mixed in together. So the word mulatto, the mixing of black and white, the word mulatto comes out into society. That's going to be a very important word to remember as we move on. But sure, they mix freely. Not a problem. Color line has not been invented.
In the harshest ways, slave owners would hang their human property by their hands and set their hands or feet on fire as one form of punishment. They were burned alive and had their heads placed on pikes in the marketplace as a warning to other captives. But we don't really need to go through all the gory details, do we? We know all too well the atrocities of the African slave trade. But are we talking about African slavery? King James II and Charles I also led a continued effort to enslave the Irish. Britain's famed Oliver Cromwell furthered this practice of dehumanizing one's next-door neighbour. The Irish slave trade began when 30,000 Irish prisoners were sold as slaves to the New World. The King James I proclamation of 1625 required Irish political prisoners to be sent overseas and sold to English settlers in the West Indies. By the mid-1600s, the Irish were the main slaves sold to Antigua and Montserrat.
Muslim pirates cruised the African and Mediterranean coastline, pillaging villages and seizing slaves. They would attack at pre-dawn on unexpected coastal towns, The Muslim raiders would kill as many of the non-Muslim older men and women as possible, collecting only young women and children to sell them into the slave markets of the Middle East as concubines or eunuchs. Many did not survive. Terrorizing Muslim pirates dispatched and commissioned from the surrounding Mediterranean countries, along with women and children passengers, and put them into the slavery. Many were never heard from again. The names of those who were captured by the Barbary pirates were read aloud each Sunday in their churches, just as those who were lost at sea. Some captives were held for ransom, but most of the money would have to be raised privately by widows and family friends and children, as Congress was unable to pay the full asking price.
It started actually in 1784 when they began to attack our merchant ships. That was the lifeline of our fledgling country. Import-export was something that we really needed. And they started to attack our ships and to capture our people and our goods and actually enslave our people. It has been estimated by several sources that at the end of the conflict, over 30 years later, that they had kidnapped 1.25 million people and enslaved them, some of them trying to actually sell them back to us for a ransom. But it's just an amazing thing in our history that we have forgotten that we fought a group of nations, Algiers, Tunis, Morocco, and Tripoli, around the Mediterranean, that were capturing our ships. We had no navy because, of course, our navy had been the Navy of Great Britain, and so we were separated from them, and these merchant ships were defenseless because the only type of cannon that they really had to speak of was normally used just to send a warning signal in the fog stating that they were there. And up to that time, international law had stipulated among nations that there was something called international waters, and within so many miles of any coastal area that ship had safe passage. Well, Muslim terrorists back in those days, these extremists that were called the Corsairs or pirates, began to attack in force in 1784. Actually, before that, they were beginning to attack our merchant ships, even while we were beginning to draw to an end the War for Independence. We gave 3 men the charge to go over and try to talk with some of these Muslim nations. They were very interesting men. One of the ambassadors to the Muslim nations surrounding the Mediterranean Sea was Thomas Jefferson. Another one was Benjamin Franklin. The third was John Adams, even before George Washington became the first president under the new Constitution. And so they went over and they basically found out that these people did not want to be reasoned with, that they only understood force, and that they had no intentions of giving up people that they had captured and enslaved at that time. Well, George Washington became the President of the United States, and the war began in earnest. And it wasn't until Thomas Jefferson became our third president that he realized we were paying over 20% of our gross national product as tribute money or extortion money to these Muslim nations. And he said, look, not one more penny for tribute, but millions for defense. And he took that same money that we were paying to these nations that were attacking us through their Barbary pirates, and he invested it into our Navy and Marine Corps, and sent them over and started taking care of business. Just an amazing thing that we don't even know. Many of us don't even know that there was such a thing as the Tripoli War or the Barbary War, and the Marines remember it because they sang in their Marine hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, and the Tripoli War is also another name for the Barbary Powers War.
So I would probably recommend for you to get for a good foundation of white slavery is They Were White and They Were Slaves. It's by Michael Hoffman. It's a decent book. As well as White Cargo. This is by 2 authors, Don Jordan and Michael Walsh. So again, White Cargo and They Were White and They Were Slaves. 2 books. There are other books that are out there, but I'll share with you what I do know about it. White slavery it's been in America. There've been white slaves in America for over 100 years. I'm talking about the hidden history of white people not knowing that they were slaves. This happened for over 100 years. And there's a professor at Yale, David Bryan Davis is his name. And the quote that's coming from David Bryan Davis, October 11th, 1990, is that as early as the 14th to the 15th century, white slaves were shipped to multiple countries. It was labeled as like a booming slave trade during that time on the markets in the Black Sea coast, into Italy, Spain, Egypt, and the Mediterranean islands, as well as Barbados to Virginia. I'm going to focus right now particularly on, since we're dealing with America, the Barbados to Virginia connection. Again, that's the 14th to the 15th century of white slaves being used. Barbados during that time would literally beat their white slaves to death. I think you probably need a good synopsis or picture of exactly what was going on, where these slaves were coming from. I'm sure if you have any basic history about it, you would know that the slaves came from England. A good idea of kind of like the way to see what that life was like is to study Oliver Twist. That's a good movie for y'all to check out. It'll explain to you that the English slums of the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th century, they were considered the pits of white suffering. Maggots all in the trash. They were eating scraps. They were cold, wearing rags for clothing. Very, very poor condition. So definitely check that out. And also during Oliver Twist times, they would like have the children, and they would have them as chimney sweeps, and they were called human brooms, because they would go down, take a little 6-7-year-old kid, shoot them down there to clean out the chimneys and stuff. So they were doing the child labor stuff, but it was a very, 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 very poor country at that particular
white slaves, man. Irish, Scottish, poor Englishmen. Facts. Y'all don't even know y'all own history. You know what I'm saying? White slaves all throughout American history. White people owning them, black people owning them. Because what y'all fail to realize is that, remember when they talk about George Washington chopping down the cherry tree? Well, it's not a real literal cherry tree. That's what school books and the whole indoctrination of the education system teaches you. That it's a literal cherry tree. No. The cherry tree is the Moroccan flag. The old Moroccan flag. For the Moors. Because they set sail with the Moors. The Spanish did. You know what I'm saying? And that's documented. You see the fezzes all throughout early American history. You see the fezzes, which are those Islamic hats. So black people were of, and I got documented proof of that. You know what I'm saying? I can read it for fact checking. Look, let's check it out. Now this is from a book labeled Encyclopedia of Free Blacks and People of Color in the Americas. Now this is page 3. This is page 3 where he talks about they were organized in multi-town chiefdoms when the first European and African travelers appeared in the region in the early 16th century. The first people of African ancestry to enter the territory that is now Alabama were the companions of Hernando de Soto, 1496 to 1542. Now that's the 1500s, 16th century. Yeah, that's right. So, who crossed the state in 1541 to 1542. De Soto took several dozen blacks from Cuba, some of whom were free. None of those conquistadors remained in the area, though. See, so what y'all don't realize is that the black people that were with him were Moors. Now that's a fact. I'm showing pictures of this right now. They drew paintings of this way back then, that event, and it clearly says Moor. You know what I'm saying? They're telling him where to go, because what y'all don't realize is that after the Spanish after the Moors were done ruling Europe because they had a fascination with blonde-haired, blue-eyed women. You know what I'm saying? It reminds me of Martin Luther King and his, you know what I'm saying, hooker fascination with white women. You feel me? That's what this whole I had a dream shit was about. Him wanting white women. You feel me? Black men have a real fascination. Or, you know what I'm saying, they have history of a fascination with pale women with blonde hair and blue eyes. Not to say nothing against y'all, not try to bash y'all, but that's just them, you feel me? That's just a fact of just black history. So the Moors, they loved, you know what I'm saying, trade in white women and just blonde hair, blue eyes. They had a real fascination for that, and they bought tons of white slaves during that time of which they ruled Europe, to the point where even during the 15, 16, 1700s, when they were still had, you know what I'm saying, some sort of control, like in Arabia and places like that, where the Americans had to outlaw, you know what I'm saying, selling white slaves because they were buying too many. You know what I'm saying? So, and that comes with the early 1800s, with them buying, you know what I'm saying, white slaves. They had to outlaw that as well in America. You know what I'm saying? These white slaves in New Orleans. That's a fact. Feel me? So, all of that comes down to the Moors running Europe. I'll show pictures of that. Them running everything around there. Not for 13, not the 13th, not 12. No, they always ran Europe, bro. Always. Up until, like, 1492 when they got kicked out of, Spain. I think that was 10 years earlier when they got kicked out of Spain. And they had to do things, you feel me? They had to work. They're like, okay, y'all kicked us out. The white man finally ruling. I'm going to give y'all a map to America. That's not what they called it, but they gave the Spanish a map to America, Christopher Columbus. And he set sail with the Moors to come to America, to sell out and enslave his own people. And there were Moors already here of certain Indian tribes. Not keep saying Indian, Native American tribes. You feel me? And that's why it was so easy for them to do this. You feel me? Or just, that's why it was so many wars. When they tell you the Seminoles and the blacks were, you know what I'm saying, rebelling against slavery. And, bro, do y'all know what was really going on? Really, really? Y'all don't. American history don't tell y'all that. I mean, the education system at school won't. But I'm here to tell y'all this. All throughout history, you see, you know what I'm saying, the Moors selling out black people. All throughout it, bro. Whenever you see that Fez, I can't fuck with it, bro. I can't. And what y'all don't realize about Moorish history is there's accounts of Moors having white people as slaves, and or just using human skin as like some type of cloth or like a coat. They had whole books made out of white human skin. Feel me? So they were skinning them. So the white people know this, bro. I want y'all to know that. The white people know all of this. And that's why they acted the way they did throughout the centuries in America. Feel me? The hate for blacks came from the Moors. Now, if you can give me a time before then of whites doing that, slavery started from the Moors, bro. That's a fact. And I really can say other African cultures didn't indulge in that. When you think of, like, that's why people put that on Islam, of that slavery thing, you feel me? Because of the Moors.
Jewish Israel Cohen, a racial program for the 20th century, 1912.
We must realize that our party's most powerful weapon is racial tensions. By propounding into the consciousness of the dark races that for centuries they have been oppressed by whites, we can mold them to the program of the Communist Party. In America we will aim for subtle victory. While inflaming the Negro minority against the whites, we will endeavor to instill in the whites a guilt complex for their exploitation of the Negroes. We will aid the Negroes to rise in prominence in every walk of life, in the professions and in the world of sports and entertainment. With this prestige, the Negro will be able to intermarry with the whites and begin a process which will deliver America to our cause.
If it turns out that black people did enslave white people en masse, right? If that turns out to be true, then black people are going to be forced to do the same thing they want white people to do. And that's take responsibility for enslaving them. And that's not something a lot of black people want to do. I'm here to talk to you about. And that is to start to change the narrative, to begin to remind these white people that they were once our slaves. And the problem I have, sir, this is the problem I have with it. The problem I have is that when white people have a national narrative and discourse about slavery, it's about them owning us. So white people in their minds, whether they admit it consciously or subconsciously, they always get to walk around with that one up, like they got one up on us. It gives them a it's got to give them a superiority complex if it in turn gives us an inferiority complex. You understand what I'm saying? And as long as you got that inferiority complex, you're always going to approach the subject matter from that angle, as if you're coming from the bottom up. Right. But if I show you, if I furnish you and impart to you another paradigm where you can look at it, if not from the top down, at least from a level playing field, now all of a sudden it's a different dynamic. It's a very different dynamic, and it will also explain to you some of the hidden fears that Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, bless that saint, an ancestor, Duau, may she live forever. It also deals with the fact that she never addressed that in the ISIS papers. She gave all these other reasons for white people wanting to kill black people and wanted to rule black people, all these other reasons for white supremacy, but she never touched on the fact that we enslaved them more than once in our history. And here's the other thing nobody ever talks about, sir. They never forgot it. They never forgot it. That's the sneaky part with white people. They never forgot it. And what they've done over the years is they've used Hollywood and their access to the media to constantly subliminally remind themselves.
Okay, I got a thought I want to share for Black History. A lot of people are under the impression historically that a lot of white people had enslaved black people. And the majority of white people couldn't afford slaves. It was an economic thing. So a lot of people, you'll find if you research the historical records, and you can start by just looking at things like land records and census records. You'll find that there's a myth that a lot of black people, it's been brought to our attention that a great portion of black people were slaves. But like I said, nothing could be further from the truth. In order for a white person to have a slave, they had to have the money first. So like I said, it was an economic thing. And when you look at economically, every white person, for example, there's an expense that comes with owning a person who the world calls enslaved. There is an economic status that a person has to be able to afford. And I'll bring it to modern terminology so you can understand. Every white person is not a business owner, right? Primarily the people that were the ones that actually had benefit from the slave trade was the people that actually could afford it. You know, they could actually afford to house somebody. I mean, when you look at houses like plantations and things of that nature, and you look at the amount of people that work for these people had to have somewhere to live, right? So in order for a so-called white person to have enslaved a black person, they would have had to have a lot of money to be able to have a place to house them, because how could you have workers if you didn't have nowhere to keep them?